Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. For this week's episode, we're talking about a podcast collective that generates millions of downloads per month. If you look at the Apple and Spotify podcast charts that track the most downloaded shows every week, you'll notice that many of the most popular podcasts belong to large networks. Organizations like Gimlet Media, Wondery, and NPR are able to pool their resources to promote their content, and this gives their shows a distinct advantage over independent podcasts, even those of similar quality. That's why some indie podcasters have formed collectives. These entities provide many of the same benefits of a network while still allowing for the podcaster to own their intellectual property. To get a better perspective of how these collectives work, I interviewed Amanda McLoughlin, the founder of a collective called Multitude. In our interview, Amanda explained her process for recruiting shows to join Multitude, the collective's business model, and why podcasters shouldn't be timid about asking their audience for financial support. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about my Substack newsletter. This week, I published a 2,300-word deep dive into a company called 6am City, which collectively has 400,000 subscribers across its 9 local newsletters. The article walks through how the founders scaled the company from the ground up and what its success means for the future of local news. To get articles like this sent to your inbox each week, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, on to my interview with Amanda. Hey, Amanda, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So before we start talking about your current company, tell me about how you first got into podcasts. Like, you launched your own podcast first, right?
I did, yeah. And I'm so happy to be here because there are so many interesting business models in podcasting right now. Mine is one of them, but it's one that I think prioritizes independence and sustainability and audience relationships. And that really stems from starting a podcast as a side project that we really hoped would grow into something bigger. But I was working in finance. I have an English degree. My first job was at an investment bank in HR and recruiting. And I sort of had this like accidental career in people management and business management at an investment bank. And so that ended up being really helpful because now as the owner of my own business and someone who helps other podcasters make a living full time, all of those sessions I attended with my summer intern class ended up really coming in handy. But on lunch breaks and in the evenings, I would be making a podcast all about mythology and folklore called Spirits with my best friend from kindergarten, where we'd have a drink and talk about a new story from somewhere around the world every week. And that is now in its 6th year of weekly episodes.
Wow. And so why did you decide to focus on that?
It is something that my co-host Julia Shafini is very interested in, and we have a dynamic where she brings research and I am kind of like the audience tie-in, and somebody who is less knowledgeable about that particular field and can just be there to listen and provide reactions and give my own commentary on the stories that we're hearing. And over those last few years, we've evolved somewhat to add new formats. We now feature listener submissions, people writing in about particular customs and folklore from places that they're from or that they have lived or their own families. As well as things like a book club and a movie night where we can feature works by other people, contemporary works, and kind of analyze them from a mythological and folkloric lens. But it's all about the stories people tell each other. And I think that's something that runs through a lot of podcasting, and certainly me. I'm curious about what stories persist and why certain stories really grip us as people and as a society.
And so you're like the comedic relief while your friend is more kind of like the nerdy fact deliverer.
Exactly. And both of us are on another show called Join the Party, which is a Dungeons and Dragons podcast where we play D&D with our co-hosts Eric and Brandon, and then edit that and sound design it into a narrative. And so that's exciting for us to have a more equal dynamic in another show where both of us are coming as players to, do our own thing and be in our own lane. But it's a sort of dynamic that I think works really well. And you can look at, like late night TV or other podcasts, other TV shows, where it's useful to have somebody bring information, bringing a story they're excited about, and somebody else is there to listen and make sure that any audience members with questions kind of hear that perspective represented in the show as well.
Yeah, I think like some of the best examples of that are like Radiolab and like Reply All, where they have a system where someone goes and does all the research, and the other person, the other host, is kept completely in the dark, so that you can hear their reactions kind of in real time, and they can act as kind of like you said, like a stand-in for the audience to ask the obvious questions that help drive the story forward.
It is helpful, of course, to have research behind the scenes and preparation where, as performers, we can bring reactions that work well, even while we've had conversations behind the scenes about, does this particular topic work well for the show, selecting guests or scholars to comment on different aspects of the story. But it's that, kind of central relationship between my co-host and I, between Julia and I, that brings people back and that they can really form relationships with. And in moving to Multitude as a podcast collective and a business, that is really, I think, the heart of the shows that we make is two people who care about each other, who care about a subject, sharing what they're enthusiastic about in a way that welcomes other people in. It's not a, podcast by insiders and for insiders. It's saying to everybody, hey, let's welcome you over. Come on, sit down, pull up your headphones and let's tell you all about why you should find this subject fascinating too.
And approximately when did you launch those two podcasts?
Spirits launched in 2016, joined the party in 2017, and then I started Multitude in 2018.
And how did you, for those additional two podcasts that you're running on your own, how did you find an audience? Like, was that like an instantaneous success, or was it a slow burn?
All of them were slow burns. And I think it definitely begins way before you launch a podcast in pre-production and in asking yourself, why should this be a podcast? Why should this be a podcast that I make? What am I seeing or not seeing in the market in terms of that specific podcast's, like niche or subgenre that I want to bring? And so for Join the Party, our Dungeon Master, Eric Silver, and our other co-host, Brandon Grugel, and I all worked on, listening to a lot of Dungeons and Dragons podcasts, deciding kind of what was missing, what we liked and didn't like about different shows. And so in that case, and in the case of Spirits, it's a question of, who would enjoy this? What am I trying to bring? And where do those people hang out online? So in looking for, other podcasts to guest on or to do cross promotions where we tell each other's audiences about the other show, or, websites to pitch articles to, or newsletters to email and say, hey, we're making this thing. I think you might find it interesting. It's all about knowing who your audience is, what they're interested in, and how you can effectively tell the story of what you are putting together so that they can decide for themselves if they're interested or not.
And at what point did you start feeling like, oh, this is more than just friends and a few of my Twitter followers who are following along? Like we have like a really engaged audience.
It's a good question. I think about 6 months after starting Join the Party was really the time where, I was in a job that was becoming increasingly unsustainable and kind of burning me out, and realizing that, going home to do this second job, basically, of making these podcasts and trying to find ads, running our Patreon accounts, kind of all of the administration that goes on behind the scenes, and the actual recording, that was the kind of thing I got very excited to do. I think pretty typical to a lot of people who kind of have side projects that they try to turn full time. But in our case too, in late 2017, early 2018. This is before, Spotify bought Gimlet. This is before podcasting as we know it is kind of a thing that gets written about in major publications back in the time where they would sort of define a podcast when they wrote articles about podcasts. And so it was clear that the industry was really going somewhere. And I also saw a gap in the market in terms of podcasts like mine, which had small but really dedicated audiences who were making, a decent, either recouping their expenses or making a decent kind of part-time living. And there weren't really services for us. There was nobody who could help us sell ads. There was no one we could turn to ask about how to build our audience, how to market. And it was just sort of felt like figuring out all of these things for ourselves. And so that's how Multitude came together, as a sort of home and also toolbox for independent podcasters to make a living without needing to sell their show or their intellectual property to a bigger network that's interested in owning and not really like servicing their show.
And so you started trying to build a business for your two podcasts prior to launching the collective, right?
That's correct. And in the process, I learned the skills like ad sales, like business development, marketing, audience development, pitching, putting together, compelling pitches for either journalistic outlets or events back in the day when podcast conferences and other festivals, were a really good marketing opportunity. And so having done that for 2 podcasts, and then, friends of mine started podcasts, asked me for some help. I got a couple inquiries about consulting. A radio station was releasing their first podcast and said, we know how to make, audio, but we don't know how to find an audience off air, and realized that I had really put together a skill set that was helpful. And so I was able to quit my day job in 2018 to work on this full time. And soon after, Eric Silver, our head of creative, joined me, and then Brandon Grukel, our head of production, about 6 months after that. And with that team, we were able to start doing kind of bigger projects, like making a show in partnership with Sony Music, making a fully scripted sitcom called Next Stop, our first original fiction show, and now, working on other shows with partners like Nicole Perkins, the co-host of Thirst Aid Kit, which was a huge successful show several years ago that just ended. And we're able to work with her to help on the production side and make a show that is hers, her brand, her idea, her intellectual property, and something that we can be equally invested in making, but also in sharing in profits from the show.
So you kind of hinted at this, but do you think there's like this cliff in the podcast market where there's a sharp fall off for podcasts with fewer than like maybe 50,000 downloads, where there aren't many places that help them make money? Like most major podcast advertising networks, they have pretty high thresholds for joining.
Exactly. There are a lot of kind of self-service tools, but not a lot of help navigating them. And like you said, it's with bigger audiences, lots of networks will come, banging down your door. But when you're smaller than that, it's not small. Like, it is very exciting for, 5, 10, 20,000 people to be waiting to listen to what you have to say each week. For me, it was exciting when the size of our audience surpassed the size of my high school, because I know what, 1,000 people sitting in a high school gym look like, and greater than that was very exciting. And so it's something where, every person who owns a podcast and runs it is a small business owner. And there aren't small business services the way there are in all other sectors, because the industry is kind of very top down right now. And all the money is coming from either, venture capital that is funding content as a way of selling, memberships or other services, or apps and tech and places that are trying to build tools. Or they're kind of legacy entertainment companies. And so they come from radio or from, audio, other kind of crossovers where they're trying to make podcasting one of their verticals. And the bulk of podcasting, in terms of the number of shows out there, the number of people who are listening, are independent. And so it's great to be able to make my living helping other people make theirs in independent podcasting.
So, in my newsletter the other day, I kind of made this analogy that I think the podcasting market is where YouTube was at like 2012, where back then YouTubers had huge volume in terms of people who are watching their shows, but like you could have like 1 million YouTube followers, and if you were an indie YouTuber, you could still you were still having like a waitressing job or something like that to pay the bills, just because the market wasn't, like the advertising market wasn't there. Whereas today, like there are YouTube channels with as few as like 50,000 subscribers that are probably making good livings, as long as they have like Patreon or some kind of like niche advertising base. Would you agree that's probably that's about where the podcast industry is in terms of being able to support like indie podcasters?
I couldn't agree more. And early YouTube, I think, was a great example of people using a new medium, not because they were, for example, filmmakers trying to, get their movies or their reels out there. Certainly there were, but there were also people like me. I made YouTube videos when I was in high school, when the platform was just starting out. And it was because people were interested in just getting to know each other. You were interested in hearing other people talk about the thing you were really passionate about, or just meeting people from other places in the world. Like, it was amazing at that time to know, wow, I recognize someone's username. We talk in the comments of this YouTube video and they live in Japan or in Russia or somewhere, that I've never been. And in terms of the industry and monetization, you're completely right. I make that analogy all the time. And I'm really glad to hear somebody else does as well. Because it really, I think, marks a fundamental shift in how consumers are thinking about content. 10 years ago, if a YouTuber said, hey, here's my tip jar, here's my PayPal, here's a place that you can give me a tip, they would be called a sellout. And there was way less, I think, tolerance, much less support for knowing that independent creators need money somehow to make more of the thing that you enjoy. And now audiences know that the money has to come from somewhere. And so they're, I think tolerant of branded products, they're tolerant of ads, or they are excited to support the creator directly and help either, obviate those things or just support them and help them make sure that they can keep making their content. So tools like Patreon, I think, really have changed the game. And now it is completely normal for a creator to say, hey, if you like this kind of stuff, here's where you can support me. And that's no longer kind of a taboo.
So walk me through the launch of your podcast collective. Like, how did it go from you saying, "Oh, I could see there's an opening for this type of services," to like, how did you start recruiting podcasters, and how were you pitching them for joining? Talk me through that, or those early days.
Absolutely. We are still very much a boutique kind of collective. We are not playing a volume game. We have currently 8 member shows and 1 partner show, working on a couple of more as well. And the idea is really, I started with the people who were close to me, the shows I was on, and a couple friends, one from YouTube, one from, childhood, like I mentioned, one from college, who were starting shows that I was interested in helping them out. And in looking at the people around me, I realized that the kind of common thread between the shows I was on and the shows that launched with Multitude are really like that sense of enthusiasm where we are celebrating things that are important to us, but also remaining kind of critical of them when appropriate. We're welcoming people in. We are asking them to enjoy this thing with us. And it was at first kind of looking to other networks and to other collectives for cues as to what they did, what we thought made sense. For example, we changed in the author field of the podcast, we changed all the authors from people's individual names to Multitude, because especially at the time, you have very few fields in podcasting in terms of SEO to put in searchable terms. And so for us being able to say on the air, instead of saying, hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Potterless, you should listen to, our friends, Spirits and Join the Party and Waystation and Horse, you can just say, put Multitude in your podcast player, we'll all come up. So for us, that sense of branding, having a central website, a central search term, and also coordinating our calls to action, letting people know, in a coordinated way each week on all the different shows, hey, we have a new item in our merch store. We're doing a live show. We have, this new item available on the website for you to check out, an article about, how to launch your own podcast. All of that was kind of getting our house in order first. And then secondly, looking to, okay, we have a bunch of podcasters here in one place. All of us have the skills of knowing how to run a show, and we specialize in things like, sound design, in audience development and social media, in business and ad sales and pitching. How can we use these skills to help out our peers? So the first folks we started working with that were outside of those founding members of the collective were individual podcasts, companies, radio stations, nonprofits who asked for our expertise and our help on a consulting basis, doing things like marketing or designing podcasts. And from there, like I said, when we got our studio space, when we had some full-time employees, our first kind of major partnership was with Sony Music, creating a show called My 90s Playlist, all about 90s music and the lasting influence of some of our favorite tracks from back then today.
So we'll definitely talk about the consulting work in a moment, but staying on the members of the collective, can you talk a little bit more about the value exchange? Like, what are you agreeing to give to them? Like, what are they guaranteed in terms of your services, and what are you getting back as a company to make the membership worth it to you?
Absolutely. So the members of the collective all own their own shows. They own their own editorial. They produce their own shows. We don't have any central, editing or mixing. But what we do share is access to our studio here in Brooklyn. We launched it about 8 months before the pandemic. So we are now on a rotating schedule to make this resource still available to everybody, as well as myself and the other 2 full-time employees. We have things like monthly check-ins with all of the shows to talk about, audience growth, about advertising, about editorial, ask if they need any support that we can provide. So it really is a resource well that folks can dip into as they need it versus any kind of like top-down mandate or style guide. And in return, I represent all of those shows for ad sales. So it really works well because if an advertiser comes in for Exolore, I can say to them, hey, we have these other great shows as well. Here's the full deck. Would you like to come on any of the other podcasts? And particularly for the shows that are building an audience, being able to be mentioned alongside a bigger show, the advertiser comes in for one, and then I can introduce them to other shows, all with the same point of contact, which is often kind of where advertisers need to screen for the size of the show. Because if one person is handling this at whatever brand, you need to kind of spend your money as efficiently as possible. So that is one big benefit. And then lastly, it's really just every show putting their kind of marketing efforts behind the collective. That is the biggest value exchange. As a podcaster, my most finite and precious asset is the trust of my audience, and being able to say to our audience, hey, if you like this show, I promise you, you're really going to like this other one. Or, hey, I went on this other podcast. I love talking about A, B, and C. You should go check it out. Or Multitude just launched a starter kit for $35 that you can buy and, check out all of the resources we think you need to start your own podcast. That is absolutely meaningful, and it's something we take really seriously, and that's the biggest value add that our member shows give back to us.
And how does that work in progress? Like, is it like a spreadsheet where this week this podcast is going to run an ad spot for this other podcast? Like, how is that facilitated?
Exactly. So we have a central spreadsheet. It took me several months to realize a spreadsheet would be helpful instead of an email blast. But we have a central spreadsheet where every week there's a different call to action specified. And it's something I feel very strongly about in podcast marketing, that your audience, you can ask them kind of one thing per episode, in my opinion, versus giving them, here's our Twitter, here's our Facebook, here's our Patreon, here is where you can, email us, or here's our merch. We say, hey, there is one thing you can do this week to support the show, and this is what it is. And whether a podcast, an individual member show, has a live show coming up, or a new item that they launch on their merch store, or it's something central for Multitude as a whole, we kind of rotate through a list of 4 or 5 calls to action. And every month, at least one of them is, hey, look at these other shows in the collective. This is one show that I think you're going to like in particular, and a good episode to start with.
And you're the person at Multitude who's doing most of the ad sales, right?
Yes. Right now I am a team of me.
And so let's talk about your strategy there. Like, are you trying to find ad networks to plug and play in, or are you going out and you're just trying to find individual sponsors for shows?
It's a great question. And I think one level deeper than conversations about ads, especially in kind of digital media and podcasting, usually is. And I'm really glad to talk about it, because we definitely do have a strategy, and we have a reason that we have sponsors coming back and signing up for, a full year of ads at a time. And the reason is that I do about 85% of our business directly with sponsors. And whether that's me approaching them, me hearing them on another show and reaching out, or them coming in and soliciting one of our podcasts, it is a really great thing, because that allows us to be flexible and creative with the sponsor, instead of going through, one or even a couple intermediary agencies, which certainly a lot of people do, particularly at higher volumes. I can work with them directly. And if, an ad we have a great idea for like a weird or interesting ad read, we can run it by them. And they are kind of less skittish, because again, you're not going through several different people, all of whom, are protective of their jobs and don't want to ask a client a bad question. And on the reverse side, if the sponsor is saying like, hey, this is kind of breaking even for us, but we'd love to be a little more flexible on the rate, like, could we go down $1 in our CPM? Then I can have that conversation with them. And it's much more of an ongoing relationship versus a single transaction of, this meal box is buying 3 ads on this show, and then they may or may not come back. And that's not something that I'll ever know when there's more intermediaries in between. So that is the bulk of it. And then certainly there are sponsors that only work through those intermediary agencies. So that is the remaining, 15% or so of the ads that I book every year, not just for our member shows, but also for clients like Helen Zaltzman's The Illusionist, which is a great podcast about language, and Rose Evelet's Flash Forward, which is a show all about the future.
And so how do you find these sponsors? Because like podcasting, obviously we were talking about how it's kind of where YouTube was in 2012, where it's got the audience, but doesn't necessarily have the buy-in from advertisers. My guess is that it's 10 times easier to convince a advertiser who's already sponsored a podcast to sponsor your podcast than it is to go find a brand that's never been advertising on a podcast and convince them to try out podcasts. What's kind of like your weekly workflow in terms of finding sponsors? Is it listening to other podcasts to see who's advertising on them?
All of the above, and 10 times might even be a little low. It is very difficult to convince somebody to try a new marketing channel. But I also have relationships with some like marketing agencies. There's one called Right Side Up, which is a great agency that helps companies, with their marketing strategy and implement new ones. And so that's a good relationship for me, A, because I love that team. But B, they are generally working with clients that are entering podcast advertising for the first time. And so I can give them a great experience. I can, work with them on the shows that I think will be the best fit. And in knowing that team really well, they come to know my shows as well. They know which ones to suggest, and we have a better sense together as to what podcasts will do better for which sponsors and really kind of increase our rate of success. But there's absolutely, I heard an ad on whatever other podcast. I'm going to reach out and see if that brand is interested. Some brands come in, as I said, especially to the larger shows. And so I'm able to kind of convert that single buy into a broader one. And then finally, we also have a number of kind of less traditional sponsorship arrangements, which are more structured like affiliate deals, where if it's a small business, specialty business, an Etsy seller, or somebody who is kind of quite small and might not have the marketing budget to buy an ad, particularly in one of our larger shows, we have some affiliate deals where we use a promo code, and then for every sale that we drive to that business, we get either a set dollar amount that we set together or a percentage of the profits from that sale. And so we use those sponsors when either there is an empty slot or a cancellation, or for some of the shows that are still building their audiences to the point that sponsors are interested in buying traditional, pay up front kind of ads.
Are you doing a lot of like dynamically inserted ads?
A couple of our shows do some dynamically inserted ads on the back catalog episodes before we had sponsors, but we are big believers in the baked in ad. And all of the ads that we sell on new episodes of the shows are read by their hosts, are personally approved by the hosts, and they are baked in for a minimum of 12 months. So after that, I recently inserted that language into our contract just to say, in the future, if we want to remove these and replace them with dynamic ads, I want that to be really upfront for the sponsors, but they just perform much better. And having an ad that is in line, that is sounds like the show, that is in the show, that has a, predictable kind of segue that might have, a fun transition or reference the content of the episode, it just performs better. It feels more intimate. And it also, on the practical side, fetches higher CPMs than dynamic ads.
Yeah, and especially since you could maybe, if you do it right, you could invest in a show before its audience gets really huge when its CPM would go up. But because you're already in it, you're going to benefit from that rise in popularity as people listen to the archives, I'm guessing.
Exactly. And it's something that we definitely rely on, and that sponsors rely on as well. I'm not interested in kind of cheating a sponsor out of money or having them kind of overcommit to a show that I'm not sure how it's going to perform. And so being able to have that baked in ad and the assurance that, if a sponsor trusts me, gets on board early, and it ends up working out, they should see some upside in that as well.
Let's shift gears and talk about your consulting business. What's the motivation behind taking in outside clients rather than just focusing on growing the collective? Is this about like guaranteed revenue?
There's certainly an aspect of diversifying our revenue where, particularly during the pandemic, in those first couple of months of 2020, March kind of through May, we saw almost half of our ads for the year cancel altogether, where we have a 30-day cancellation clause that's quite standard in podcast advertising. And a lot of sponsors were like, you know what, we're going to cancel it. And we might be back, we might not. But right now, there's so much uncertainty that we have to either scale back or just pause all of our marketing. So that would have been really terrifying if our entire business were based on ad commissions, which certainly a chunk of it is. But we also have these other lines of revenue. Like we have a membership program for Multitude where people can become monthly supporting members and see, new content. They can see live streams, kind of behind the scenes newsletters and photos, things like that. But we also have this consulting where we, make shows for people. We consult on development, on marketing, on, growth, on membership programs for other podcasts. And it is good for that perspective of diversifying our revenue, but it's also really fun. It's also a gap in the market. It's also a case where, more independent podcasters being able to make a living for themselves in the industry is really good for me. These people are not my competition. They are my colleagues. And I want to do everything I can to help them succeed, because more of us being, robust kind of small business owners who can opt into new technology platforms, services, because we want to and not because we think we have to, makes the industry more stable for all of us.
Do you think the market is really heating up for freelance podcast expertise? Like, I feel like every brand who's bought into content marketing is now buying into the idea that they need to have a podcast budget, but it's not like enough to where they want to hire like full-time staff. Like, do you feel like, and I feel, and I also subscribe to a lot of podcast industry newsletters. There's tons of news like agencies that are launching out specifically focused on, helping brands produce podcasts. Like, is this like a really heating up market?
Another, I think, really helpful analogy to early YouTube, where companies launched YouTube channels just because they thought they had to, or had sort of like the youngest person on the marketing team, take a stab at the new vertical instead of asking if it made sense for them and what kind of investment was necessary. And I actually think pre-pandemic, kind of late 2019 into early 2020, I saw the sort of frothiness, of that bubble starting to heat up, or that trend starting to heat up, where companies would just kind of reach out and say, "We need a podcast. Don't care what it's about. We have a $20,000 budget for 10 episodes, and let's go," which is not realistic. And I think there's also a really parallel important conversation happening around unionization and workers' rights at full-time podcasting studios, and rights for freelancers, where a lot of the studios, the huge names that you hear about, like you say, are relying on freelance work. They undercompensate employees. They might prevent them from working on other gigs and also not pay them enough. And certainly, most of them don't share intellectual property rights, derivative rights, or profit with the employees that work on the show. There have been instances of platforms even firing the hosts that, made the show what it is, that started it, and who brought in the initial audiences, because the hosts have no protection and the platforms have all the power in that case. And I think and hope that folks are starting to kind of mature their thinking around this here in 2021, where it's not useful to be in a market just to be in a market. It's not useful to have a social media account or a new media platform just to have it. And I think, like it took brands, a lot of time to figure out that YouTube channels need strategy and investment in order to work really well, the same goes for podcasts. And so whenever I get on the phone with a brand, my first question is always, what are you hoping to accomplish? What are your metrics of success? Why are you doing this? Why is it a good fit for your brand? Because if there aren't solid answers to any of those questions, I know that I would be setting myself and the client up for failure if I were to enter into that arrangement. So, we're fortunate to be able to really choose our partnerships and our clients carefully. And I hope and think that more brands will start to kind of think that way as well, as in the same fashion, more kind of robust jobs with good salaries and benefits are hopefully being created at these monoliths and these big platforms.
Are you able to upsell any clients on advertising within the Multitude Collective to help them build the audience for the podcast that you're helping them create?
I have not. I don't think there's been an instance of a show that we have worked on running an ad on our shows, but we certainly do plenty of both.
Because I think Gimlet was doing that. I don't know what the state of their creative agency side was, but like they would launch a show with the creative agency, but then to help that show gain listenership, they would then advertise across Gimlet's owned and operated shows.
I think there's a way to do that if there is sort of a firewall between those two operations. But, if I were to be involved in both sides of that, I don't know. I want to have repeat business. And so I would be really careful if I did that the fit of the shows was really right. I think our shows are great and our ads perform and our advertisers want to come back. So that might be a good fit. But I think, exactly as you're indicating, there are a lot of companies out there that claim to do it all and be an all-in-one solution or an all-in-one platform for podcasting. And when I see those, I run for the hills. And I'm a huge believer in platform diversification, not just in terms of reaching my audience, but also services, where if I rely on the same company for podcast hosting, marketing, ad sales, and whatever else other service that they're trying to sell, editing even, that would be really bad for me if something happens, or if corporate leadership made a choice that I didn't agree with, or the person I was working with was fired, or there was some kind of change in company policy or strategy. So I am a big fan of kind of owning every part of your show and having lots of options available to you, and not putting all your eggs in one basket.
So let's switch gears and now talk about the platform. So you have these huge companies like Spotify and Amazon. They're investing in podcasting. Spotify's probably spent about $1 billion so far acquiring various companies. Amazon just spent $300 million on Wondery. I wonder what you think this means for the future of particularly indie podcasts. Like you can look at what Spotify's doing with like Anchor and acquiring ad tech companies and kind of trying to recreate the ecosystem for YouTube that YouTube did for YouTubers, in the sense of like, it's pretty amazing that a YouTuber with only 1,000 subscribers can opt into this advertising network and start, monetizing with a relatively tiny audience. And that really allowed a lot of small YouTubers to scale up. So it seems like Spotify is trying to do that, but also, with these major platforms competing, now they're centralizing podcasting, which obviously can be bad for indie podcasting. Where do you kind of fall on what this means for the future of indie podcasts?
I think YouTube is a really good parallel here because on the one hand, like, yes, there is not really an easy way for a podcast of any size to monetize. People claim to offer that service and be that solution, but the fact is that nobody has gotten it right, and make ads that are, robust demand, that are a fair price, and also don't sound terrible, and that give the podcaster some amount of control over what is shown on their show. That doesn't exist. But at the same time, I think we are stronger for it. And we are stronger for the fact that there is not one dominant platform currently that monopolizes all of podcast listener discovery, which is like the big, the white whale people are chasing right now is how do you help people find new podcasts? And I find that to be a really great thing. I like that marketing and audience acquisition and development is kind of inefficient in podcasting right now. And it can be so frustrating as a podcaster to make something, to know that it's good and to not know where your audience is and how to reach them. But at the same time, from a broader perspective, we don't have one platform's search algorithm that is kind of determining trends. And, we've all seen it. All YouTube videos are 45 minutes long now. And when I started out, all YouTube videos were 4 minutes or less. In the kind of content creation, you search and chase whatever that algorithm is prioritizing. And that is bad for creativity, bad for, democracy in ways that we have seen. And it is something that, I don't know, it takes choice out of creators' hands. And so I hope that we keep being a weird, decentralized, kind of fragmented industry where, we're based on technology that helped people discover blog posts in, 2001 or whatever year RSS feeds were created. And in the meantime, I'm going to do my best to help independent creators navigate that. But it's something that I am suspicious of as I see more tech and more articles and more acquisitions happening, trying for everybody to be the all-in-one platform. The fact is that what companies can never buy is a relationship with an audience, an authentic relationship between a listener and a creator. And that is what podcasters need to keep in mind and need to sort of cling on to when all of the other challenges feel so overwhelming, that your relationship with your audience is something that cannot be manufactured. It is valuable. That is why platforms want your account. That is why advertisers want to be on your show. And that's why different services want to process your, transactions and your file hosting and all of that.
Yeah, to continue the YouTube analogy, like when I visit the homepage of YouTube, for the most part, I'm not even shown video or channels I subscribe to. I'm shown videos that the algorithm has determined that I want to watch. So while YouTube created a huge audience, I can't guarantee direct access to that audience. Obviously, same people complaining about that with Facebook as well. And so with Spotify, I'm grateful that it's probably bringing a lot of new podcast listeners into the fold that had never listened to podcasts, but it also has its owned and operated shows. So when my show, how far is my independent show going to be pushed down because it wants to shove one of its owned and operated shows or one of its partnership shows through NPR or something like that? Is that what you're kind of hinting at?
I'm totally with you there. Yeah. And that's why I think it is so important that podcasters think really seriously about direct audience support. I think almost all podcasts should have a manner of letting listeners support them financially. Most of our shows are on Patreon. We use Memberful for our multitude membership program, the Multi-Crew. And, whatever the services that you use, it is really, really important to have that direct connection with your audience. And that's something that was lacking in the early days of YouTube. And I think would have helped a lot of creators, stay in business, be able to scale, be able to support themselves. I stopped making YouTube videos because I, was in college and working almost full time to pay my tuition and didn't have time to make the, 2, 3, 4 videos a week that the algorithm kind of demanded at the time. And so the fact that podcasting is predicated on a technology that directly allows people to get notifications for content that they have opted into, to me, is a fundamentally beautiful thing and something that I hope we don't lose access to as we move toward kind of more platform war dominated discourse around podcasting.
Do you think Patreon is the best podcast membership platform on the market? Because like there are lots of startups entering this space where they allow paying like they generate customized RSS feeds for paying members and then allow you to insert them into some of your podcast players. Do you think Patreon's the best one? Does it offer kind of like the best services for that?
I do believe so right now. Yeah. And kind of referring to my earlier distrust of all-in-one solutions, I do like that my content is hosted and provided by a different service than people pledge their financial support to my show. And that gives me options if I ever need to change one of them. It's not, a total move off the platform for all of the aspects of my show. And at the same time, I think it is valuable that there is some kind of name recognition in Patreon. People know what a Patreon is, what becoming a patron means, and that is work that we had to do, over the last 6 years to kind of educate people as to what that is and why we need it. So I think it's a great thing that more people are trying to fill gaps and to make services that suit their own needs and, hopefully acquire customers. But right now that's the best solution that I see.
Do you think that podcast subscriptions will always be hard to grow simply because some of the major platforms like Spotify don't allow customized RSS feeds?
Do you mean subscriptions like people becoming patrons, but they can't get the bonus audio because Spotify won't support it?
Yeah, Spotify won't support it. I think there are a few other platforms that don't really support it.
Yeah. I definitely feel a sticking point in helping people to access bonus content that they pay for. And certainly some people become patrons or become members or support you because they just want you to succeed and they don't care about the extras that they get. But it is definitely a challenge. And a fair amount of my week is spent answering sort of customer support emails as people have trouble accessing the bonus audio or, the Discord for listeners of Join the Party. So there is absolutely room for improvement. And I'm always rejoicing, when I find a solution to a problem that I have as a sort of earlier adopter of this medium. There are lots more options available to people now and a lot less kind of, finicky like back end of WordPress, plug-in customizing than there was 6 years ago when we first started our show.
Yeah, I think the tech is so clunky, and because all these platforms are competing with each other, it's just going to be so hard to do. I actually think that Wondery had the right idea, that basically they launched an app that had all their Wondery shows on the same app and then had like a group subscription. Yeah, it's not ideal from a user experience side of things because they have to listen to their Wondery shows on a different platform than they listen to the other podcasts. But at the same time, like you think of like TV streaming, like people have to go on Netflix for some shows and Hulu for some other shows. I wonder if that's kind of where we're heading in terms of being able to really at scale monetize with subscriptions. I don't know. What do you think about that?
We are definitely moving toward a more consolidated sort of TV streaming like industry as a whole. But I'm just really encouraged by the amount of people that are still supporting independent creators and doing their best to, make a couple $2, $3, $4, $5 pledges here and there and make sure that the content they really believe in stays around. And I think the kind of technological speed bumps that you are describing are part of why podcasting is so special and why podcast audiences are so amazing, where people find a way, they navigate a really annoying, in some cases, technology to get more of the stuff that they love, to follow you, to support you. They can't go to the comments and comment on an episode they really liked. They have to go to a different app and go to Twitter or Instagram or email to get in touch with podcasters. And yet they do in kind of startling percentages. And it's amazing. Like people who love podcasts love them so hard and they love them so much. They listen to tons of podcasts. If they like one D&D podcast, they're probably going to make room for 2, 3, 4, 5 others. And that's why I am kind of fundamentally optimistic about the industry and why I'm so eager to help and get in touch with more independent podcasters, because we don't take listenership away from each other. We're not kind of TV networks competing, for like a finite amount of viewing time each evening. People who love stuff make room for more of it. And if they're fans of one thing, they're going to love something, a little bit different, but in the same lane that they find due to a, cross promotion or a guest appearance on another show.
A lot of the podcasts in your collective have individual Patreons, but you mentioned that you have some kind of group bundled subscription using Memberful. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it is actually a standalone subscription. So it's not a bundle or a discount across the individual show's Patreons. It is, I don't take a cut of anyone's Patreon. I just take commission on the ads that I sell. So it's important to me that the shows retain, 100% of their revenue and total control over how they make money on their own shows by direct listener support. But what we do have is the multi-crew, which is a way for people to support and invest in multitude and new work that we make. And so that is the distinction for us where, in some people take the brand jobs to pay the bills. Some people take investment, to from outside sources to make new podcasts. And a ton of the new shows that we're seeing come out all the time are, like I was saying earlier, backed by, tech money or big entertainment money in some way. And it's really hard to find the time and the money to pay everybody fairly and start a new podcast, not knowing what the audience for that show is going to be. So our audience support via the multi-crew helps us to do things like take time each month to have like an all hands kind of brainstorming meeting where we come up with, different takes on what a multitude version of, fill in the genre here podcasts would look like, to do pilots, to, spend resources working on ideas that may or may not see the light of day.
So how do you pitch that to listeners?
We describe it as a way to support Multitude's mission and to support new work from us.
And so you run it almost like a normal kind of ad slot, like you would like to promote an individual Patreon, but you say for like you mentioned before, you have this spreadsheet where there's this rotation. So is it like every podcast plugs that memberful thing like once a month, or how does that work?
Exactly. Yeah. It's one of those rotating calls to action. And the central benefit for people who join the multi-crew is a weekly podcast featuring a rotation of all of our hosts. So all of us are on this program, Head, Heart, Gut, each month, different combinations of us, where three of us kind of do a structured debate with very intense research about a very low stakes topic, like, the best primary color or the best ice cream flavor or the best thing to do at a theme park. And so the benefit for people who join is that they get another weekly podcast from us. And that's the biggest complaint we get, that we don't have more shows and more content, and that our bi-weekly shows aren't weekly and our weekly shows aren't twice weekly. And it also gives all of us a chance to get together in different combinations because, not all of us guest star on each other's shows, regularly. And so being able for all of us to get together and talk about something outside of the subject matter that folks are used to hearing us talk about on our individual shows, that kind of like remixing and cross show appeal and collaboration is the thing that folks are investing in when they join the multi-crew, and the thing that they enjoy getting as a benefit.
How long ago did you launch the multi-crew?
We launched it in the summer of 2019, so almost 2 years.
And how successful has it been?
It has been a real backbone of the company. It was something that we relied on, to be candid, when our ad commissions vanished for 3 months in 2020. And we actually saw people increase their support of the multi-crew and our individual shows' Patreons at greater rates than they had before during the pandemic. So that's something that really amazes me, that people, in a time when all of us were cutting costs and prioritizing out of necessity, decided to prioritize content that they really enjoyed and creators that they believed in, to do their best to, help us stick around. So it's great. And it's something that I think, again, most podcasters should have some kind of way for people to support them individually. And often I hear from podcasters who are worried about launching it, worried about asking, worried that they have to kind of hit a certain listener milestone in terms of people or downloads or, age or number of episodes before they can launch something like that. And my advice is always, don't stand in your own way. Some people are going to want to support you. It is not up to you what your show is worth to someone else in terms of dollars. And even if you say, hey, this is available, no pressure. It's here for you. If you want to join, please do. And, never mention it again and just have the link on your website. People are going to join. People are good and they're savvy and they get it and they want you to succeed.
Video podcasting is becoming a huge thing, with several major YouTubers generating a ton of views for what's essentially like a video version of their podcasts. I know that you said that you have a physical studio in Brooklyn. Are you trying to build out those capabilities at all? Like, are you bullish on video podcasts?
It is not something that we have done a ton of experimenting with, but what we have done a lot of in the last year are digital live shows. And so having the physical space with, hardwired internet and a pretty decent camera and good lighting to be able to do digital live shows has also been a great way for us to kind of offset some lost revenue from tours and physical live shows we'd planned to have in 2020. And also it's just a great thing for listeners, no matter where you are, what country or continent you're in. person, you can attend a live show with us, which is exciting and kind of holds appeal for people. It's a little bit of revenue that can come in, and it is also a way for us to, help raise revenue, make some money in a way that has no overhead. Unlike physical merch, unlike physical touring and live shows, it is a way that we can give our audience something extra that they can opt into and buy a $10 ticket if they want to, or a $10 video on demand streaming of the show that had already happened. And that's ended up being just hugely fun for us, hugely fun for them, and something we're planning to continue even once physical live shows are a possibility again.
So speaking of physical live shows, like prior to the pandemic, or are you planning post-pandemic to do like actual Multitude Collective podcast tour, like live tours, like that are in person?
Yes. So we had done a number of them. We had kind of a mini tour before the pandemic and had a show at the Bell House here in New York and one at City Space in Boston that we termed Multitude Live, a variety hour. So we had all of the hosts at Multitude doing different stuff. None of the segments were just a live version of the podcast. All of them were us, either doing an adaptation, like making a game show out of our normal interview show, or doing a, PowerPoint presentation about a topic we wish could be a podcast, but isn't enough to be its own podcast. And so that was so much fun and something that we would love to bring back. Additionally, the individual podcasts have done live shows in different cities to make this financially feasible. We generally structured those and scheduled them around other trips. So if we were, being flown out to a conference to give a keynote, we would also schedule a live show for that city or city nearby in related days. Just before the pandemic, we had a live show in Austin as a colleague was getting married a few days later in Houston. So it's something that, we, like anybody, we share a minivan, we share an Airbnb, we keep the costs as low as they can. But it's something we love doing. And particularly in podcasting, when you don't have that easy kind of direct connection with your audience, it is just super special to be able to meet people in person, to, see their tattoos of our logos, to meet their kids, to sell them merch, to take pictures and give hugs. So it's something we're really looking forward to doing again when that's possible.
Yeah, I've heard the cost can really run up quickly and it's hard to make those profitable.
It is either the venues, have flat rental fees that are really high. And for a lot of people, it's out of the question to lay out $2,000 on a show where you're not sure if you're going to be able to make that back, or they have door splits and minimums that could be that you end up owing the venue at the end of the night, even if you sold, 100 tickets. So between smartly choosing our venues and also selling merch at the live show, all of our shows were either break even or slightly profitable. But you're right that it's a lot, particularly doing shows outside of your own city. So that's why for us, kind of bundling that with a existing business or personal trip ended up being the only way we could really make those physical live shows happen in other cities.
Okay, Amanda, well, those are all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
Absolutely. You can check out me and Multitude and all of the free resources that we post, by the way, for podcasters at multitude.productions. That's our website. Or you can plug Multitude into your podcast player and all of our shows will come up. Multitude is at Multitude Shows on Twitter and Instagram, and I am at She's So Mickey on both platforms. But a link to that is also at multitude.productions.
Awesome. Well, it's a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast, so if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.